Let's run through a very quick primer on what the kinds of thought processes you go through as an engineer as you work your way through a quality function deployment and a series of houses of quality shaping through. Remember, QFD is the interlocking set of houses of quality used for your analysis. Each house of quality is a set of matrices you use to equate the what's and the how's in order to prioritize and build metrics around the elements of that level of your design going through your system. So this particular example happens to use 4 tiers. There's nothing magical about the 4 tiers. It's also a fairly oversimplified example drawn from the IT world. So it's not meant to be a realistic system. It's not meant to be a realistic QFD. It's only meant to illustrate the kind of thought process you tend to go through as you work your way down these different levels. So I'm going to be going through just very, very briefly 4 different instantiations of discussions I might have from top to bottom. As on a single project, at one phase I'm talking about the business requirements, the next phase I'm doing a functional specification, the subsequent phase I might be doing a system design, and a final phase to do operational planning. So again, this is not meant to be a realistic life cycle, and it's heavily IT based. You'll have to extrapolate from this discussion to other life cycles with different or other numbers of phases, as well as systems engineering tasks that might involve disciplines other than software system engineering as you go through. But I think you'll see that it represents that thought process fairly well. So the first house of quality, the first set of matrices you build, are about translating customer needs into your business requirements, perhaps. So your whys, your what's into your hows. So what the system has to do is help customers lower cost and get better service and be more functionality. So you got customer needs driving the definition of the rows, and they would get ranked in importance so that the relative weightings come out. I'm not doing that here to illustrate, but the relative importance would be set. Likewise, you'd come up with a set of requirements as you go through, however you choose to do that as you see your way through. So in this little example here, I simply drawn a component of a flow diagram for what's happening inside the process that I'm trying to build into my system. And that is that I have this daily process that feeds transactions to a weekly process, and that's what I'm going to have to design as I go through. So the diagram, the requirements become the columns of my matrix, the elements of it, while the needs become the rows. And I do my ranking and ordering to come up with a relative importance of each, not shown here. But I'm going to quantify that as I go through. Likewise, in the matrices, I need to be quantifying things. So when I look at transactions flowing from A to B, I ask myself, well, what kinds of measures might I want to track? I think of it in terms of a dashboard. If I wanted a dashboard for this process, which is why I need a dashboard and a scorecard for my control plan for my system, I'll think in terms of what would be on the dashboard for monitoring this process. And I like to think of measures in terms of dials. What dials would I want to watch? So in terms of transactions flowing from daily process to weekly process, I might just want to know the sheer number of transactions that are flowing through, or I might want to know their value or their volume or their units, depending on what they are. Are they orders? Are they finance? Are they parts? Are they materials? Whatever I'm measuring, they have value, volume, and units that I might be tracking as they pass through on my transactions. And I might want to know their value, volume, and units per transaction. So again, these aren't concrete measures here, but they're the kinds of things you might measure at this level to establish what I want to be able to measure in my business requirements. So I've prioritized my requirements, and I have decided how I'm going to measure those requirements coming through. 2 things I'm doing in every house of quality. At that point, I can move to my second house of quality, which is my functional specification layer. The business requirement model that was on the bottom of the prior version moves to the top. It becomes my rows. So what were the columns of QFD1 become the rows of QFD2, and now on the bottom I do my actual functional specification process. I might look at my daily function feeding my weekly function. I'm aware that a daily function can't interact in real time with a weekly function. I've got to bring the data to rest. I'm going to need some kind of a transaction data store in between. So I know my daily function is going to feed transactions into that data store, and on a batched basis I'm going to feed them into the weekly process. So there's a difference between the level of detail I'm going to try to model at the business requirement level and that which I'm going to do at the functional spec level. Again, it's just a function of what types of engineering you're doing as you go through. But those functional specs become the columns of QFD2, so I can now go through and decide what are the most important components of the functional specification in terms of their relative importance to each other and in the meeting of the business requirements. I'm also going to do my measurements. So how would I want to measure this kind of information coming through. Transactions, again, are being batched. So I already have transaction measures from the prior dashboard, but now I'm interested in my batching of transactions. How many batches are being processed, and what's the value, the units, the volume, and the number of transactions per batch. I also want to measure batch freshness, because if I'm doing a weekly process, the question becomes, how old are the older transactions going through? Suppose I pull my batches every Sunday night, but it turns out most of the transactions are generated on Monday. They're not going to be that fresh. If most of my transactions get generated on Monday, perhaps my weekly function should run on Tuesday. So I need to know the freshness of my batches, and again, I'm going to weight that by value, units, volume, and transactions going through. So again, I'm prioritizing my functions in QFD2, and I'm deciding how I would measure the things happening at this level of the system, so I'll be able to build controls later. You're going to now recognize the pattern here, so I'll go a little faster for you. The functional spec that was the bottom of QFD2 comes to the top. That now forms the rows of QFD3. I now do my system design, which is really, in this case, is looking at how am I going to implement that transaction data store. Is it going to be a push? Is it going to be a pull? What kind of medium will it be on? So I might decide that my daily module doesn't send transactions. I build an extract module to pull them. That's what we do as data warehouses, which is my field. And I feed them into a keyword delimited batch interface feed that goes to the weekly module over time. Maybe I cut a tape that gets sent to the data center on a regular basis, or things of that nature. So I'm deciding what my system is, and the system design becomes the columns of this matrix, and I do my rationalization, so I know the relative importance of each going through. Then I establish what kind of measures do I want at the system design level. My runtime, my CPU, all my technical measures start to kick in here, both on their own and by different kinds of transactions. How many records and keywords am I processing on the back end? Things of that nature. So how will I control and measure what's happening in my system design going through? And then finally, I can do my fourth level of operational planning, where I have to develop the procedures for the new columns when I move my system design into the rows. So I'm going to need procedures for each of those modules and for making everything work. So how many generations of my interface feed will I retain? Will I skip slow days on my extract procedures? Things of that nature. What are my weekly procedures for verifying what's been extracted? So I'm operationalizing my system in QFD4, and then I would come up with the measures that I will use for that going through as well. How many skip days were there? How many increments and batches did I run? Things of that nature. So what do I want to measure operationally? So I end up with not just my 4 tiers of engineering models, but I've got numerous places throughout all 4 levels and throughout my design where I have defined a key metric that I can use to control the system as it sees its way through. Obviously, those metrics associated with the higher priority requirements will probably get more attention, but with unlimited resources, I'd want to measure all of these things, maybe build statistical control around them so I could tell outliers when they're occurring, and really monitor and control my system very, very well. Remember, your requirements and your design and your engineering is about more than just making the system do what it has to do, but how will you monitor, control, and continually improve that process. So a lot of your engineering should be going into these metrics regardless of what the underlying functions are as you go through. Then one last thing, most requirements that people write in requirements documents are not really pure requirements as they go through. So here's an example. All account maintenance screens shall use the latest release of the secure sockets layer protocol. What we don't want to do is take that statement from a customer or a user or someone, a stakeholder in our process, and simply record it into whichever matrix we happen to be working on right now, because it really doesn't fit anything in our model in any real way. So this diagram depicts the fact that that statement, no matter when it was made, actually requires us to provide some kind of an update to every tier of our model. It implies it is a privacy requirement for the customer CTQs that I might not have known about. It implies it is an account maintenance process that I might not have recognized when I did the first QFD. It implies on the functional side that account maintenance has a data encryption capability that's going to be required, and that the account maintenance function has definition update and retirement for maintenance kind of activities. It also, because it's secure layer sockets, it presumes on my system side that I've got a web interface and HTTPS. And finally, it presumes that I'm going to use the current release, which means my operationalization, I better do the upgrade procedures and ensure that there's a privacy visibility going through to satisfy that original privacy. That one sentence coming from a stakeholder can result in a pretty massive update to everything about your document. And as I do that, if I'm building this into my model and if I put data encryption in my second house of quality and I map it as a 9 or high level requirement against account maintenance, at that point I should be looking at all the other functions that I might have built into QFD1 and QFD2 to say, do any of the others benefit from data encryption? So that one statement has a ripple effect that might cause me to make significant changes across my entire operational system. So if you have a quality function deployment set up with all the appropriate layers, it isn't just documentation for stuff you already know, it's a way to model and modify what you're learning as you go so that each new thing you learn gets plugged into the correct place, something we don't often do as engineers. Plugs things into the correct place and allows you to do that kind of impact analysis to say, what other impacts should I be seeing from this, such that your engineering is far more complete and, because of the measurements, far more accountable and more controllable over time.